Hello, let's talk about jQuery UI widgets. So this category of widgets that they talk about is kind of all of those bits and pieces of user interfaces that you're used to thinking about making up, I guess, like in some sense the boring aspects of a user interface, things like buttons or sliders or dialog boxes, etc., etc. Ways that a user can be presented with information and provide input into the system. As I said when I was introducing jQuery UI, some of these things were brought into existence because HTML and CSS didn't really handle user input as well as they do now. These days, the widgets that are available just as part of HTML are super impressive and work really well. But the jQuery UI things are still really neat, and they get you up and running with particular kinds of user interface elements very quickly. So I do want to just have a quick look at what's available in the jQuery UI widgets, and I want to particularly dwell on one of the widgets that is a little bit more challenging to create if you're making it on your own in HTML, which is the idea of a dialog box that pops up. So to do that, I'm going to continue with the prisoner example that I've been working on. You may remember this code from previous jQuery UI videos that I've been making, and you may remember this web page, which is what the code is. So we have this idea, and if I reload it, the prisoner shakes because they want to get out of prison. Who doesn't? And we can drag them around. They get a nice highlight that's using an effect. This dragging is using jQuery UI's draggable, and the tunnel is a jQuery UI droppable, such that if I drop the prisoner on it, the prisoner gets out of the page and the tunnel vanishes, and everybody is left perplexed as to how this was achieved in the narrative of this web page. So the code for this is available in the notes for this video if you want to look at that. And otherwise, you can just continue on if you've been following along yourself at home. So like I said, I'm just going to look at one of these widgets. You can see that there are a lot of widgets. I'm here on jQueryui.com, as you might expect. There's quite a few of these. There's accordion menus, there's this autocomplete function, which I think could be pretty fun. Buttons, there's checkboxes and radio buttons, control groups, date pickers, dialog boxes, that's what I want to look at, menus, progress bars, select menu, slider, spinner, tabs, and tooltips. There's a bunch of stuff in here that you can use to get up and running with an authentic user interface very quickly. I'm just going to look at the dialog example so that we see how this particular thing works, and also get to take a quick look at the demos and maybe some of the API if we need to as well. So let's click through to the dialog. And what we see when we look at the demo, right, is a dialog box. Like this is a dialog box, right? It says basic dialog, and this is the default dialog, which is useful for displaying information. Thank you very much. And as they mention, by default, you can drag it around. So it's got some of the draggable stuff, and you can resize it. So that's all sort of default behavior that comes with this dialog box. And you can also close it if you hit this X button, and it's gone. So quite a large amount of cool stuff that is going on with that dialog box. And so as always, like, how is this being accomplished? Well, let's view the source. So how's it being done? Kind of incredibly, it's being done with this one line here inside our funny wrapper function, which is that we're targeting an HTML element, and we're just calling the dialog method. That's literally all it took to make this quite sophisticated dialog box appear on the screen with draggability, resizability, and a close button. All of that stuff came for free by calling this method. So that's amazing. The other thing we should just quickly point out here so that we, and let me reload actually so that the dialog box comes back. There it is there. So if we look at the HTML that's being used, we can find the element that's actually on the page that's being transformed into a dialog box. That's the way that the dialog works, is that it's actually based around an actual HTML element. It kind of makes sense. So in this case, it's a div. It has an ID of dialog. That's how it's being targeted here with jQuery to call the method on it. So the whole div becomes a dialog box when we call that method. And one thing we notice, if we just scroll up quickly, it's got a title bar here and it says basic dialog. That title there is being generated by providing a title attribute to the div, right? So that's how you specify what's going to be displayed in the title bar. And then the information inside the dialog box is all inside this p tag here, right? That's where the information that's actually displayed inside the dialog box. This is the default dialog, etc. That's where that comes from. So that stuff that's inside the div appears inside the dialog box. So the div is the dialog box. So so let's do this ourselves. Let's add a dialog box to this simulation of ours. So the first thing that we're going to need is some actual HTML. So let's add it. Doesn't really matter where we add it, but let's add it after the prison and the prisoner. And we know that we want a div, and we should give it some kind of ID. Let's call it, what are we going to call it? Introduction dialog. That's going to be its ID. And we know that we want to give it a title, because that's how we specify a title for the dialog. So let's do that as well. Welcome to prison. And then we'll close the div. So that is our dialog box, right? That's going to be able to turn into a dialog box with this title. If we want it to say something inside, we should put content inside that div that will be displayed inside the dialog box, and I'm going to add a p tag here. And in the p tag, I'm just going to write an instruction, escape using the escape tunnel, just in case the user is unclear on what to do. So if I were to go and look at the page right now, because I haven't done any of the dialog magic, right, then this is just going to be treated as a standard div, and it's not going to look very exciting. There it is there, right? That's my div. Because we haven't applied the dialog magic to it with the dialog method, it's just a standard HTML element. So we need to go and apply that magic in our script. So that's the element. I need to select the introduction dialog, and I need to call the dialog method on it. So let's, where shall I do this? I'll do it at the very top. So select the, what was it? Was it introduction? Introduction dialog element, except that it's an ID, so I use the hash symbol. And then I literally just call the dialog method on it. That will transform that div into a dialog box. Let's go look at that. There it is there, right? So instead of a boring sentence underneath the prison here, we got that thing that we wanted. It's draggable, it's resizable. Whether or not that's a good thing, you be the judge. It's got our little title in the title bar, and it's got the text that we put inside the div, inside the dialog box. And indeed, we can close it with the X and kind of go about our business interacting with the page. One thing to note, of course, is that it's there right from the beginning, right? Which is fine. That's in this instance, I think, because it's the instructions, it makes sense that we want it to just appear from the very beginning. So that's the absolute basics. But again, we might want to explore what some of the further possibilities of this dialog are by looking at more of the demos that are available over here. So what else might catch our eye? Well, one of the things that is really useful with dialog boxes, and it's often something we want to do, is that we often want to force somebody to respond to the dialog before they move on to other things. Right now, this welcome to prison message, I can still interact with the rest of the page, right? It might be nice if I force the user to, first of all, deal with this so I know that they read the instructions, for example, and then they can interact with the page. When we create a dialog box, that means that you can't interact with the rest of the page until you've dealt with the dialog box. That is called a modal dialog box, modal. So just for instance, we can look at, is this one a good one to look? That one looks a bit complicated. Let's look at this one. So this is a modal confirmation dialog box, and the key thing here is I can't interact with the page behind it. So for example, I can't click on this link until this is gone, right? So I delete all items, or I cancel, or whatever it is that I'm doing. Now the page in the background becomes interactive, and I could click this link if I wanted to go to example.com. So how is that being accomplished? Again, we can kind of figure this out from the script in here. There's a bunch of stuff in here. There's another thing here actually that I think is particularly helpful. We can see that it's being made modal just by using modal. It's an option called modal. And again, we could look at the API if we wanted to know all of the possibilities. But here, if we set modal to true, then the dialog box will be modal. So let's add that in. So instead of just calling dialog with no options, let's provide an options object, and let's set the modal option to true. Now back over in our example, you can see that there's like a kind of a gray background that's telling us that the rest of the page is not interactive. So I can't drag the prisoner anymore until I have closed this dialog box. So I close it, and the modal thing means that now the page is interactive and I can interact with it. So a modal dialog is a way to force interaction with your dialog. The other thing that's probably nice if you have a preference for a controlling personality like me, you might notice they've got a setting that's resizable, and you can set that to false. That is to say, disable the ability of the user to resize the dialog box. So if you like the size it is, maybe let's add in resizable false. And now if we go and look at our example, we can still drag it around, but it's no longer a thing that we can resize, so they can't make it look gross, for example. We can also do things like disable it being draggable and much, much more. But let's just continue with the demos for now. Okay, so the other thing that we probably notice when we're looking here is this thing that says buttons. And the fact that that corresponds over here, if I reload the page, to buttons down the bottom here. So instead of adding buttons in the HTML, which you could imagine doing and would work, you could include buttons inside your dialog box that way. jQuery UI provides a really nice streamlined way of adding buttons to your dialog box when you create the dialog box using the buttons option. So if we go again and look at the source and we compare it with what we see, so here we can see there's a button that's called delete all items here and another that's called cancel, right? So how are they doing that in the code? They're doing it here with this option. So this is just yet another option inside the dialog when we create it. And you can see it's an option called buttons, and inside inside the buttons is an object, and that object contains the buttons. So we have them, the property name inside that object is the name of a button, and inside that is a function to call when that button gets clicked, and then cancel is another name of a button, and the value it's set to is another function to call when that button gets clicked. You can see that both buttons, when you click them, all they actually do is close the dialog. So they say this, which refers to the current dialog, which is the key dialog method, and then they say close. We know from looking at Draggable, for example, that this is a way that you can kind of send special commands to a jQuery UI feature, such as Draggable. With Draggable, we could, for example, say disable and enable. With Dialog, we can say close to close the dialog. That way, when we click the button, the dialog box goes away. So let's add this feature to our prison simulation. Let's change the dialog a little bit so it's going to ask them a question that they need to answer with our buttons. So welcome to prison. How are you going to escape? Question mark. And then we'll add the options inside our script. So how are you going to escape? Let's give them some buttons to specify. So we know that we want to add a buttons option, and inside that we're going to create, it's called buttons, good grief, an object, and the properties of this object are going to be the names of the buttons. So we could write anything here, but let's write, the first escape method is going to be imagination, so that's the imagination option. That will call a function when they click on the imagination button. And let's, for the moment, just say that, just as in the example, we'll say this.dialog, which targets the dialog box, and we'll send it the close message so that it will close. So we've added a button called imagination to our dialog box. Now if we go and look at it, it comes up, it says, how are you going to escape? And we just click imagination. And that will close the dialog box because it calls that dialog close method. So now the user can specify how they're going to escape. Let's add another one, which is probably more relevant, which is the escape tunnel. That would be probably quite a good idea. So we create a property called escape tunnel, and we provide a function that will do, for now, let's just do the same thing. So close the dialog. So there's one button called imagination that calls this function, and another button called escape tunnel that calls this other function. Both those functions currently do the same thing. And voila, how are you going to escape? We get our two buttons. It's all nicely formatted. It's got a nice little line. It's like it's doing a lot of work for us in HTML and CSS to construct a very reasonable looking dialog box. So now we can say we're going to escape through the escape tunnel, and then we could actually do it. Hey presto, we carried out what we said we were going to do. So that's nice. The final remaining thing that's maybe a little obvious is it would be nice if these buttons were actually relevant. Right now all they actually do is close the dialog box, which is effectively the same thing that the X button does up here too, right? So let's actually make them a tiny bit more relevant, right? So let's think about the escape tunnel, right? So if we're going to escape through the escape tunnel, maybe it should only be available if you specify that you're going to escape through the escape tunnel. So that means that at the very beginning of our program, we shouldn't display the escape tunnel. So first of all, let's hide the escape tunnel in our script. Again, we can do this right at the top. So let's target the escape tunnel, selecting it with jQuery, and hide it. So that's the first thing. So when we go and look at our program, now there's no escape tunnel. So if we say we want to escape through this escape tunnel, when I click on this button, the escape tunnel should become visible, right? Because that's what we've said that we're going to do. So how are we going to make it become visible? We need to use the show method on the escape tunnel, and we should only show it if they click on the escape tunnel option. So that would be inside this function, because this function is called when that escape tunnel button is being called. Again, we can target the escape tunnel, and we can show it by calling jQuery's show method. That way they click on escape tunnel, it shows the escape tunnel, and it closes the dialog box. So we get, how are you going to escape? Escape tunnel, I click, and, and nothing happens. Why did it not show up? What has he done? You probably saw it while I was typing it, because you're actually paying attention. I wrote a dot in escape tunnel instead of a hyphen. That's what happens when you're me. Let's try that again. I'm going to escape through the escape tunnel. I click the button, and hey presto, an escape tunnel appears in the cell, which the player can then escape through. Sorry, not the player, the prisoner. This is not a game. This is not a game. This is prison in HTML. So we could also, of course, maybe we want to show it using an effect. We know that we can specify an effect. So let's use the blind effect to show it, for example, so it kind of unravels itself, like in the way that it disappears. So escape tunnel. There's the escape tunnel, and then we escape. Lovely. That's pretty satisfying. So the other option, the imagination option, currently doesn't work, right? If we click imagination, we don't have the escape tunnel because we didn't click the right button. Now we're just kind of stuck in prison, which is not nice. So let's implement a way to escape from prison that uses your imagination. So there's different ways of doing this, but for now, let's just imagine that you can escape from prison using your imagination by imagining that the walls don't exist, right? So what we want to do really is disable the containment option on our prisoner, so that they're no longer contained by the walls of the prison. So how do we do that? Well, in this imagination option, this is where we need to do it, right? Disable the walls. How do we do that? So if we want to change an option, because remember with the prisoner, if we scroll to where? It's all the way down here. Remember we set an option on the prisoner called containment, and we told it to contain the prisoner to the prison. So we specify the element that it has to stay inside. We basically want to change this so that it's contained within no elements, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, we need to go to change the option later on. And you may remember that we've already looked at how to do this, but let's go quickly and just look at the draggable documentation for this. So I'm going to type in draggable, and I'm going to go to draggable methods because I happen to know that's what we want to do. Oh, no, let's go to the quick nav. That's a better idea. Okay, go to the quick nav, and we know that it's a thing that we want to do to the draggable element, the prisoner, at some point later. And the thing that we're wanting to do is change an option. So we're going to want this option method here. If we click on that, we can see that we can, we want to set it, right? So we want to find this one down here where we can actually specify an option name and a value. So for example, if we were wanting to set the disabled option to true, you can see that this is how we would do it here. We would select the thing. For us, that would be the prisoner. We call the draggable method, and then we specify this special option message that we can send to it, and we tell it what's the option to set. For them, it's disabled. For us, it's going to be containment, right? Because we want to change the containment option. And what do we want to set it to? They're setting disabled to true. We want to set containment to none. So let's apply that in our imagination section. So we're going to target the prisoner, by ID, and then we're going to say draggable, and we're going to use the option method to set an option. We're going to set the containment option, that's what it's called, and we're going to set it to none. So there is no containment being applied to the prisoner. What that means is when we go back, if we click this imagination button now, what we're going to do is we're going to tell the prisoner to basically remove its containment option. So when we drag them, they're no longer contained by the walls, right? Because we set containment to none, so now they can kind of make a break for it. Run, prisoner, run. As we know, tragically, the prisoner is kind of still they are technically still inside the prison because they're still inside the div in the HTML hierarchy. So maybe you need like a sort of larger existentialist way of thinking about solving this problem. But at least visually, that's a nice effect, right? Like if you run the game, the simulation, it's a simulation, with the escape tunnel, then you're stuck inside the walls, like the walls still work, but you can go into the tunnel. If you run the simulation by clicking on imagination, you get no tunnel, but you change the nature of the walls. So it's just a nice simple way of applying some of these user interface concepts and applying them to kind of like a sort of a narrative world on the page instead of thinking of it in terms of traditional user interfaces. Of course, it is well worth going and looking at the documentation. If I keep going back here to the Dialog demos, if you go and look at the API documentation, you're going to see there's a lot of more options and events and so forth that you can use to get even more sophisticated with your dialogues. For example, auto open is an option where if you set it to false, as they're doing here, it means that the dialog box, when you create it, it won't immediately be visible, which is often what you want to do, right? You want to create it, but you want to display it later on. And how would you open it if you want to open it later on? You probably should be thinking, if you're thinking about this, that there's going to be a method to open the dialog box. We already know about close, right, which is where we send a message to the dialog box to disappear. We were doing that inside of our buttons. There's a corresponding one called open, right, which opens the dialog. So if it's closed, then you can reopen it or open it for the first time if you disabled auto open. So again, having a browse through the actual API, particularly just reading the option names and the method names and the event names is a good idea, just so that you kind of get a sense of some of the possible interventions that you can make in this quite complicated and flexible object. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot more of these widgets. All of the widgets in their documentation and demos and so on, they work in the same basic way as a dialog. So I'm going to leave off this video here and leave you to explore them for yourselves rather than overwhelm you with a torrent of other widgets. Dialog is super fun, and many of the others are very fun too. I really, again, you probably already get the sense, I really like this idea that we can take these very traditional user interface elements and incorporate them into other kinds of design and user experiences that people aren't expecting, especially because people, they have really particular connotations with traditional user interface elements, and you can build on that to have some really interesting effects, I think. So that's it for me and jQuery UI widgets. Have fun playing with dialogues and all of the other widgets of your widgety dreams. I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Bye. He said, missing the button. Bye. Again. Bye.